I am Therese Nadler, registered dietitian. I have been in this field for about 11 years now, and I've never worked in a conventional, traditional setting like a hospital or anything like that. I did my rotation as part of my internship and basically was like, I'm never doing that again. So I spent many years in corporate wellness, and I was really more on the business side of nutrition and how to scale it and implement it in different facilities, particularly for folks that are stuck at desks working long hours. And over the years, I've just evolved. I've sort of always done some one-off, counseling sessions and things like that when people ask. But I've moved as I've grown, got married, had a child. I have moved more and more into kids, an interest in kids because we have problems, like a
Yeah,
lot of problems.
there's some
And
stuff.
yeah, and so that really came out of more personal interest and personal growth, and also being asked by moms, like, what is this? What do you think this is? Here's what I'm hearing. Here's what the school's telling me. What are your thoughts on that? And it just became more and more obvious that we have a real problem here, and the problem is partly within the kids, but I think there are some larger constructs within the medical system itself, our food supply, chemicals in the environment, in our water, that's creating a lot of havoc in terms of health. So you and I kind of connected a little bit randomly. Gotta love the internet for that part of it. But we really connected just on, I think, some of these principles. And here we are. We just
Yeah.
decided to start doing this to help, talk about some of the issues that we're hearing about that we think are important, that are not necessarily addressed by conventional approaches. Things that you can do to help your child. There's nothing worse or nothing that can make you feel more helpless as a parent watching your kids suffer. And also go to doctor after doctor after doctor after specialist, spend all this time and wasted energy and come away in the exact same place,
Oh,
six
yeah.
months, 9 months, a year later.
Oh,
Um,
gosh. Yeah. I think that you just hit the nail on the head. We just sort of aligned on that pain point right there. I think a
yeah,
lot of parents feel really helpless right now. And as for how I ended up in this little spot, we've had such different paths, but it's so interesting that here we are in the same little precipice trying to talk about that pain point. For my background, quickly, I also am a registered dietitian, licensed dietitian, nutritionist. I have a master's in public health nutrition and a bachelor of science in human nutrition and foods. And just like you, even though it was a kind of a different era, when I did my first clinical rotation as an undergrad, I was like, no, this is not for
yeah.
me. And at the time, this was a while ago, at that time, there was no integrative health at all. So if you were becoming a dietitian, you either went to work for a formula company or you went to work in a hospital. And you really didn't have much to say, that was not for me. And it took me a while to come back around. And I did end up doing that graduate degree and getting my RD with a very different path. And it took me more into the realm of possibly entering into nutritional epidemiology or research or policy. And that didn't happen either. And again, you mentioned your own parenting journey. That's what pulled me into private practice, which is something I never planned to do. And
Right.
it was all about discovering that the pediatricians we were working with, and this was, in the Boston region, they were not helpful. I'm just going to be honest. My son had a lot of issues with feeding, growth, gain right from the start. It was super challenging. It wasn't anything in my training that had been very well covered, even though I'd rotated through all kinds of pediatric stuff, WIC clinics. I was just like, well, who's helping these families? So my practice was really more of a rescue mission for my kid. It wasn't a business plan. And it turned into, like you mentioned, moms coming to me for help. And now that was 25 years ago. And,
Yeah. It's
wow,
worse.
it's
I
worse.
mean, it's right. Like it's not, you hope in 25 years time things are better.
Totally. I totally hoped that. At the time, I was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. Wait till I tell my doctor. And I quickly learned I guess I'm going kind of hard here. They were not interested. And even though I'd rotated through a lot of settings where you're working with physicians and stuff in my training and worked a little bit, in some of that prior to becoming a mom, I knew physicians didn't get to study nutrition. I know they don't.
Right. Right.
But
It's
it
limited.
never occurred to me when I became a mom that pediatricians wouldn't really either. And what I discovered early in my son's first year was they really didn't have a lot of knowledge to help things that related to gut health, nutrition, immune function, nutrition, so I was like, oh, wow.
Right.
What,
It's totally out of their wheelhouse because the whole conventional medical system is here's a pill, here's a pharmaceutical, take this, or we're going to do a major medical intervention like surgery.
yeah,
That's, I think, how more the medical system here, where where we're aligned, that's where we send people.
yeah,
And I will say, I think with the rise of, you know, people getting frustrated and then also functional medicine and some of the superstars in that world that people are aware that there are different methodologies really related to gut health nutrition that can be beneficial before
yeah,
you have to take pills or do surgeries that can actually have a bigger, better long-term impact. So in
right.
that sense, the awareness has become a lot greater in 25 years, but the knowledge and going to a doctor's office and having to sometimes explain, I even went through this recently, like you have to explain, well, here's what I think, or here's what my labs are this, but here's why I think this is happening. And sometimes they're open, they're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Let me just like look that up and da da da, and they're on their computer. Um, and then other times they're just a little bit more dismissive, like, oh, okay, but you should really go see a specialist, you know?
Right, right. Yeah. Well, that's exactly it. There's been this kind of amazing explosion of interest in functional medicine, integrative health. Now we have entities like IFM, Institute for Functional Medicine. There's all kinds, there are naturopaths, which
Yeah,
sounds silly. When I was young and completing my undergrad, there kind of weren't any. There was literally no even language for this stuff. So
right. It was like
now
your
there is.
grandma. Like, you know what I mean? It'd be like someone's grandma or someone's great grandma who would like have these homeopathic remedies, that would get passed down word of mouth. But
Right.
there is some of them work, they
They
actually
do,
have
they do. And
benefits.
now we have language and now we have a lot of exciting stuff going on. But what I noticed over my many years in practice is it wasn't being offered to kids.
Right.
Children, pediatrics, it was kind of off limits.
Yeah.
And that, if you go into functional medicine, there's not a lot of functional medicine pediatricians. I mean, the ones that are out there hopefully listening, maybe they'll be like, hey, what about me? What about me? Which is
Right.
great that they're brave to go into there. But in my experience in talking to so many parents who found me from all over the globe, this is a universal frustration. This is
Yeah.
universal. We are misguided with how our children are getting health care right now. And it's kind of turning into sick care from cradle to grave. And when I juxtapose that with my years in my graduate training, these things weren't even heard of. Nobody gave babies reflux medicines. Nobody did endoscopies on babies. Nobody did colon. This is kind of routine now. And like all these other
Yeah.
things have gone crazy. And that's what we're here. We're kind of here to dive into some of this stuff and come at it from the perspective of like, hey, wow, wait, what about these evidence-based, nutrition-focused tools that actually do redirect all this for kids?
Yeah. And I would say, I think for a lot of people, the problems really began in the mid 90s. And there has been a lot of direct correlation and causation with certain environmental chemicals that were introduced and considered GRAS, which is basically safe, but not really effectively tested to be proven safe, that were introduced and have created a lot of havoc for a lot of people since that time. Um,
Right. And
but
at
it's
the
hard. It's a
same,
mystery, A lot of
yeah,
times you're just dealing with symptoms and you go to your doctor and they're like, "Oh, well, okay, I can handle this symptom because it's in my lane, but these other ones aren't really, you got to go see a specialist." So then
right.
you bounce around and you spend a lot of time talking to a lot of different people and it just seems like nobody can put all the pieces together. And that's where the functional medicine, or nutrition also gets involved because
Right.
We're looking at the whole body as connected systems. We're not looking at things in silos.
Right.
And that helps, like a detective decode, what you need to, visit and
Yeah, and
really
this
dig
is
into.
so critical for children. And I'm curious about your training because you did your graduate training at Columbia
I
University
did. Yep.
and you had a public health nutrition focus.
I did. And I thought, like you, I was going to go into policy when I was at, at Columbia. Mayor Bloomberg was the mayor. He was big on nutrition, posting calorie counts, really trying to make people aware of the fact that you have control over the dietary choices you make, and they can truly affect you. Because we have a lot of, pockets of the population in New York City and the outer boroughs where like they are food deserts. There's really very few choices for healthy foods.
Right.
So I was super interested in that. For years, I had worked at Whole Foods, and I definitely thought I was going to be interested in that world. And when I did my dietetic internship, you have to spend basically 9 months working for free in a variety of, areas in nutrition to learn about the field. My very last rotation was corporate wellness. And when I did that rotation, the woman that I interned for was pregnant, having a baby in September. I finished my rotation with her in July. She called me in August and she was basically like, would you be willing to backfill for me? I know you're not even an RD yet. I need you to pass that test. But she's like, I need someone with business background. She's like, you'll get the nutrition piece, you'll learn it. But can you do that? So that was really kind of on accident how I landed, in corporate wellness, but it really made sense to me because I'd spent my whole life in the corporate world and I understood the pain points. Um, and I loved working with a really motivated population. When you sit down in these major Fortune 500 companies, these people are not wasting time. They are like, I have a problem. I need to deal with it. What do I need to do? And then they take that ball, you counsel them, you work with them, you overcome barriers and issues, and you work with them for 10 to 12 weeks. And I love that. It was great. And then it was really, again, once I was a mom and once I start getting asked questions about kids over time, that I got more and more interested in the pediatrics. And I began to hear more and more stories, both from adults and parents, of the futileness and the frustration that they feel, with the current medical system. And there is a better awareness of what nutrition and lifestyle can do to help you, feel better and heal. Um, but when you go to those conventional settings, it is often a lesson in a lot of frustration.
Yeah, and I'm curious too, so many little bits there really resonated as you were talking with what I ran into clinically. And again, I never planned to be a clinician in private practice. I mean, I had all the training and skills for that. I didn't have a business
Yeah.
training, which would have been great because I would have made some money. But I had excellent training for the clinical detective work and putting it in context and really turning kids around. And what you said about when you're working with the Fortune 500 folks, they're very motivated.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? Parents, moms are super motivated right now. And
I
they
know
call me
because they
up.
know there's
Yeah,
a
they
problem.
contact me and they would be like, I got to do something about this. We've been to this specialist, I mean, there probably isn't, there is not a top children's hospital center in the country that I haven't collected failures from, if you will. And I
Right.
mean, that's a harsh statement. I'm not saying they're failing. I am saying parents will go to those extremes. They go as high up the ladder as they can, and they'll pay for help or they'll go outside network, they whatever, or in network, and still their kids are not thriving. They're not growing. They're not well, and people are just kind of throwing up their hands and going, well, maybe a psych med now.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah.
I think to your point, like there is something about a mom's intuition, and I felt this too, all right, well, they're the doctor. They probably know best, right? They had many more years of medical training than I do. But at a certain point, you have to advocate for your child when their issues are not being addressed, right? Because at the end of the day, the way the medical system works with the reimbursement policies and how much time a doctor has with you to spend time on you and really dig into like what's going on here, it's just not enough time.
No, it's something
Typically,
like, from what I've looked at data on that, it's somewhere between 5 and 7 minutes that you might get for a pediatric visit.
it's
And
so
in
short.
order,
Yeah,
I feel for these folks because in order to make money, if you own a practice, it must be high volume. If you
correct.
don't own the practice and you have a corporate overlord for lack of a better word, you have to put out. You have to put out, and you don't get to give good care. And this is quite visible in a lot of health indices in our child population now.
Right.
And
And I think to your point that you raised, I think this is sort of a field that finds you. I don't know that there are many that choose it.
no, right?
You know,
I don't
it's
advocate.
very, yeah, it's very
It's
heavy.
hard.
It's very, like emotionally draining, because you're working with people that are really close to like wit's end, and
Yes,
the
they are.
suffering, and the frustration they feel and watching their kid just go backwards. It's a horrible feeling. And I think to your point, most dietitians, we as a group, we tend to be like very good students. We're very good at executing. And I think as entrepreneurs, that's generally not most of our skill sets.
Right.
So
And
yeah, you like,
it's so true. And I certainly didn't, I know my training was earlier on. I did not get training in business anything.
right,
And
they send you off and you have no
no,
idea, like,
no, you're just
what
supposed to
platforms
go
do I
follow
need?
orders. And
Right.
I think one of the most galling things about being a dietitian is, I don't know if people know this, physicians have the authority to write diet orders. And if you're in a hospital, of course, you're in there for an acute care. You're not there for preventive health, whatever. But whatever happens, it's going to come down from a physician who has no training in nutrition, virtually no training. And this is just kind of always, I guess, like you said, dietitians were good students and whatnot. And then there's kind of the renegades who don't fit the square pegs, which certainly was me. And I didn't know that. It took me a lot of banging into walls before I was like, oh, I'm not supposed to do that. And yeah, I remember right away. And as an undergrad in that rotation that I had questioning during grand rounds, and boy, did I hear about that. You're just
Interesting.
supposed to be in the background, be wallpaper until you need to fill out a tube feeding order or something. And I know that's probably not fair at all to all the hardworking, very hardworking dietitians who now are free to do much more than that. When I entered my graduate program a few years after finishing undergrad, and I'd done different things for a while, worked in a research lab, all kinds of stuff, and decided, yeah, I'm going to go do this credential. I actually put something on my application about not wanting to choose Jello or ice cream for people in a hospital. That was a mistake. Once
Uh,
again, Judy bangs into a wall and realizes, no, that's not politic. And it turned out the woman who became my advisor definitely did not like that and did not want to admit me to the program. And there was another person there who was more interested and forgiving and like, look, these are the people we need. We need to train, whatever. So I ended up in the door. That's a whole other story what ensued. But yeah, it's really, I think part of the dilemma here is our physicians don't get trained in nutrition or food. It's not in their toolbox to treat you with food, of course. And they don't have time. And I'm not knocking them. The whole system is kind of built that way. And
yeah.
I've heard many physicians over the years who kind of have joined this other fold or sort of noticed like, wow, this is a way forward. I have heard a few of them say, well, we were trained that this is fluff. This isn't relevant. This is just not real.
I heard there's
No,
something like one day in all of their years of training. You know
right,
what I mean? Spent like touching on very briefly on the role of nutrition.
right. Well, I wonder if it would be interesting right now to jump into that anecdote that we were thinking about discussing today and showing an example of where this lands a family. Where does family end up
Yeah.
when nobody's guiding them? Have you got that up in front of
I
you?
do, I do.
Yeah,
So, okay, so we're going to do sort of like a case study here, just to give you
sure.
an idea of what dietitians can do in situations where someone comes to you and is basically like, I have, a situation, and here is the situation from the mom's point of view. 8-year-old boy with a long history of picky eating since around 2 years of age. His primary concerns are irregular or uncomfortable bowel movements, possible constipation or digestive imbalance of some sort, frequent tummy pain when eating, red bags under the eyes. She suspects related to nutritional gaps or sleep issues. Um, Current eating patterns, very limited variety in the diet, a lot of resistance to trying new foods, and other things that I think, are sort of implied here is, inadequate fiber. Is there enough fluid intake? These are the sort of things that, would come up right away. And how do you deal with an 8-year-old who's been a picky eater since about 2?
Right. Common for my inbox. And right off the bat, again, these things aren't normal. I'm just going to say it. They've been normalized. They've been completely normalized. Not normal. It's just not normal. And I don't mean to use that as a judgment, like, oh, you're doing it wrong kind of thing, parent, or no, that's not it. What I'm trying to say is if a child's gut and digestion are generally working as designed, if you will, then the appetite is tends to be innately curious and you don't end up with this rigidity. Tends to harken back to there's gut dysbiosis, there's malabsorption of certain types of protein. I mean, there's all kinds of layers here that over the years in practice I've done a lot of learning and investigating on this.
I think also our food system and what we consider normal here, where everywhere you go, your kid is fed or offered the same like 5 things on a kid's menu,
Right.
that reinforces the idea that we're only going to eat chicken fingers and French fries and cheeseburgers and pizza and pasta with butter, which
Right.
is white, white, white.
Right. And
Go to
that
Europe,
basically comes down to two foods. It's
right,
wheat and dairy.
right, and a little bit of meat, usually
Yeah.
highly processed. And if you go
Yes.
to Europe, there aren't really there isn't that proliferation of like, hey, here's the children's menu. Like, here's the menu. Make it
Yeah.
work,
Yeah. Okay. So
And
true. So true, Therese. Yeah.
and
When
I
I
think
was a kid, there, first of all, I love like repeatedly dating myself here, but when I was a kid, children didn't really go to we didn't go to restaurants.
no. I mean,
Those
that's
are for adults. I know that's going to blow the heads off a lot of people hearing this, but
it
I'm
should.
not saying children shouldn't go to restaurants, but if we went to a restaurant, there was no child menu really, very little of that. And you just, whatever, that's a whole other conversation. But I think for this little guy, right off the bat, we can go into like what would be a nutrition care process here to investigate this. But right off the bat, I'm like, how does a mom take her kid for 6 years to the pediatrician from age 2 to age 8,
Yeah.
and this problem has persisted for 6 years?
Well, because I think
That's
here's what I think.
75% of
Yeah.
this kid's life. He's
I
been
think, right.
walking around in this marginal state.
Because I think, and this is even something that like I experience and I hear a lot about is like, well, starting in toddlerhood, they're gonna get into picky eating, they're gonna backslide, like all those pureed fruits and vegetables and pouches and things that you gave them as a kid that they just ate willy-nilly, they're gonna become, like much fussier about. And they're gonna have, part of toddlerhood, right, is exerting your will, right? Your force, like I don't want that or I do want that, learning that you can say no. But then I think it gets reinforced because parents are like, well, I don't want to make a whole meal that this kid's not going to eat, right? Most parents are dual working families. Like you can't be a short order cook. You have to get dinner on the table and you have a certain amount of time after work to like get your kid home, get them fed, get them bathed, do the story time, the bedtime routine, and to bed. Um, and so I think the idea in toddlerhood that it's okay for kids to become picky eaters and really have a limited palate, that has become normal. And then it gets reinforced by these kids' menus. And then moms just saying, like, well, I'm not going to make this for them. They don't eat that
Yeah,
anymore. So I'm just
right.
going to eat what they eat. So then you're on this hamster wheel where you're just reinforcing, unfortunately, these things that you know are not great. And everyone, particularly the doctors, will say, well, oh, they're going to outgrow it. Most kids outgrow it. But I think in this case, usually I would say by like 6 is when kids should be open again. You know what I mean? To trying new things. At least that was my experience. And if you still have a kid who's super, super particular or like very, like a lot of kids have issues with smells. They don't even like being around food. You know what I mean? That smells like something they don't want. That's a problem.
Right. And these are all things. One of the things I've thrown up on my site for many years, I put this together. I put together a thing called the sensory nutrition checklist.
Yeah.
And it's a quick checklist of clinical signs that relate to nutrition deficits. So for example, kids who have issues with food texture or smell, that can relate to zinc status in a kid. Or if they have issues with texture, smell, or chewing, or if they're teeth grinding, or if they're eating things that aren't food. They want to
Yeah.
pick up a lot of, fabric, pencils, metal things, hair, or sand, or dirt, or ice. Then they definitely have a mineral issue that warrants investigating. They may have anemia. They may have excess lead or mercury in there. So you can look at all that stuff. Once you resolve those, if you find if those findings are positive, meaning you find a wayward mineral imbalance, you correct that. What we think of as behavior isn't, it's not behavior. It's an adaptive organic response to a mineral imbalance. When I hear about picky eating, on my checklist is, first of all, I want to know how much has this impacted this child's growth pattern. I
Right.
don't know if that whole conversation about the first 1,000 days of life, so critical. You don't want your child's growth pattern compromised in that window. That's not great. It's reversible to a degree, depending on many factors, but that's going to affect their brain as well, depending on the severity of the impairment. Picky eating that shifts a growth pattern downward should be addressed, and it's not, mom, you're doing it wrong. Once again, it's like, where's our medical community? They're not even assessing for that.
And
So
it, yeah,
typically a kid needs to hit the 5th percentile. They'll say, oh, failure to thrive. Here's your GI referral. You might need a feeding tube. There's so much room before your kid gets there. And a child who presents like the one you've described here, he might be in that window. Like, I'd like to know all of his growth parameters and look
history. Right.
right?
Yep.
What is his current body mass index? And with children, that can look falsely healthy if they're stunted as well as underweight. So if, for example, let's say their picky eating has been entrenched long enough to affect how fast they gain weight, if it also started to affect how fast they get taller, they're going to look proportional and their body mass index might look okay. But if you do a deep enough analysis, you'll be able to see, oops, this child stopped getting taller as well. So they're now underweight and stunted. And that's an even bigger nutrition problem.
For
So,
sure.
yeah,
And the only thing I wanted to just touch on for a second here when you were talking about the mineral imbalances is this is not standard testing that your pediatrician is going to run.
correct.
No to run. So this is the other piece of this. And this is where, functional integrative dietitians come in because you can look at the symptoms and then assess the types of testing that needs to be done. And it's not, we know blood tests with little kids are really challenging, so there's other tests that you do either through urine, saliva, stool that will allow you to look for some of these deficiencies or imbalances, and allow you to sort of start narrowing in on where the problem may be.
Exactly. And that's what the nutrition care process is that I've used for years and years. It's kind of an amalgam of what we were both trained in for a nutrition care process evaluation for children, and then layering in these functional and integrative pieces so you can just sort out what to fix when and how. And I can't emphasize enough, growth pattern is it for children. I mean, that is, if you look at data historically across the globe on health outcomes for children between age 0 to 5 years old, if they are faltering on growth pattern, that is the keystone. Then everything else is downstream of that. So one of the dilemmas in functional medicine, of course, it works for adults, is we would look at all these tests and we tinker with different supplements or different supports around that, but they're not growing. So if you do that for a child, and I've encountered many cases of families who've talked to a functional medicine doc and their child is not improving. And it's usually because they've done a lot of lab tests and done a lot of micronutrient analysis, but they didn't do anything about growth pattern or food intake because they didn't know how to assess that or how to fix it. So that has to come first. And all these other little pieces will work a lot better downstream of that. And it is so true. It's like, how do you get that situated with your primary care guy? That's
It's
tricky.
hard when they have 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Uh, and then my other question for you, Judy, is with the growth pattern, knowing how important it is. And this is part of the reason when you take your baby, and they're always assessing them on the growth charts, right? Like they're always giving you percentiles for those first few years, to make sure that you're tracking. Um, if a child suffers in the growth pattern in those first couple of years, are there long-term downstream effects? Do they ever fully recover and come out of this once the issues are
Yeah.
addressed, or are there lasting long-term,
Well,
lingering?
yeah, really interesting question. And this was part of my training in my public health nutrition grad program was, and again, it might just be because it was a little bit of a different era that we weren't in the era we are in now, where healthcare is so extreme on the end of whatever's profitable is what gets attention. And
Right.
I finished my graduate work in the late 80s. So this is a long time ago, and got my license and all that. And at the time, very much still in the evidence base, very much front and center was how nutrition and growth patterns relate and what do they do to help outcomes. So there are some very critical nutrients in utero and in those first 1,000 days. I would say iron is one of them, for example, and can it be reversed? It depends on the severity of the deficit and the duration.
Got it.
So some of these things can be reversed and repaired. Some of them cannot so much if there's a big enough deficit early on. So I've had a number of cases, and we're not talking about children in the third world. Now that
Right.
in this country, our healthcare system is, I'm going to say broken, pretty well broken. And
Yeah.
we don't pay attention to what you and I are talking about now, nutrition, food, and these other things that engender good health. A lot of very well-to-do women I've spoken with go through a pregnancy and deliver with anemia. And even though that's screened, it may not have been adequately addressed. And you will typically see stunting in that baby, even if they're full term. And that's a very different outcome. And iron is also very critical for all kinds of normal evolution, if you will, in the brain.
Yeah.
So that's a biggie. As far as growth impairment, like stature and weight, you can generally reverse those. Of course, once girls are menstruating, they're not, that's difficult to change. So I've had some cases of girls who grew up with some stunting, it was never noticed, and now they're quite short. They might be as short as 5 feet tall or barely 5 feet tall. And no, they're not going to be able to correct that stunting when they're 17 and they've already been, yeah.
Right. And then my other question for you, because I've seen this too in a few instances where mom gives birth to the baby prematurely, and I'm super curious about premature birth rates because I feel like there has been a very large increase in that, over, again, since the 80s, 90s. Um, but you have these premature babies, and so a lot of times when you go to the pediatrician, they're given a pass, right? Well, they're premature, so they're not going to be able to hit these markers or hit these, they're going to be behind on growth, like all these things, they get a pass for like a number of years. And I have found in a few cases that there are larger overriding issues in that child that are basically blown off because they were premature. But that mom in her mind is like, something's not right here. But this doctor, this expert is telling me, like, don't worry, they're going to catch up. It's going to be okay, you know? And so I also am curious, if that's also part of the problem. Like, has that been something that you've heard about or noticed as well?
Yeah, yes. That's a big topic in itself, like what you're mentioning about why are these rates changing? How are they changing? Yeah, that's a biggie. Of course, always in those cases, I'm using a preemie chart. I'm not using a regular kid growth chart. And in terms of just nutrition replenishment and supporting gut, brain growth, learning, being, whatever, the growth chart for that, it's always my starting point and looking at, is this child growing as we might expect, given when they were delivered, when they were born? And I'll adjust my expectations in terms of milestones to that timeline. Although that is kind of another conversation. I feel like those goalposts have moved too. So, like I started hearing parents coming into my practice saying, oh, my child's 2.5 and they're not talking, but I'm told it's okay. It's not okay.
Like my kid, here's what I was always told. It's like you develop either verbally or physically, right? So by two, your kid's either like the runner, and like language is a little bit harder for them to grasp. Or on the other spectrum, like they, can recognize colors, letters, numbers, all this stuff, down pat, but like they're still crawling.
It's almost like this phrase toddler diarrhea, which didn't exist in my training. And now I think there's even a diagnosis code for it. Why did we normalize that? Why are we normalizing? Yes, kids have developmental spurts, they have growth spurts, but to suggest that, oh, your kid's either a mover and shaker or a thinker, I think again we're normalizing things that aren't normal, that weren't there at another, in the arc of my career.
It was like the question is our medical system bending to the problems? Do you know what I
Yes. Yeah, I think absolutely the problems are profitable. I'll just say it that way. The problems are and have become profitable. I don't know if we can call that intentional or not. It doesn't matter. At this point, they just are. Yeah,
Like
there's
the
not will to redirect it in our healthcare system. There isn't really any will to do that. And even if you're a practicing physician and you are a pediatrician or what have you, and you're interested in this, how in the world do you do it? Because your practice is based on that model of selling pharmaceuticals. Basically, that's what it is.
oh, yeah,
So it's hard. It's hard. How do we steer it in the other direction? And for the mom who wrote in the example we were looking at, there's other little signs in there too that might be pretty easy for a pediatrician to look at if they had some background, and they perhaps don't. Like for example, iron studies. When your child is a year old and you get a little heel stick and they check hemoglobin, right? It's a little teeny stick and everybody's happy because nobody cries. It's easy. But hemoglobin is not an iron, it's not iron, it's hemoglobin. And it doesn't tell you where iron is or what it's doing. All it tells you really is there enough iron to make enough hemoglobin, which is the oxygen carrying protein? That is the last thing that's going to slide. If you have an iron deficit, your body does anything to keep hemoglobin intact. And if you look at a lab result for hemoglobin, you'll notice that reference range is very tiny. So there's a very small tolerance for that. If your child has a normal hemoglobin, it doesn't mean they don't need iron. And in this example that we're sharing today with this mom, this little boy has some shiners under the eyes, I think. That's classic. That could mean a couple things. Iron status is one of them. And you would need an iron study to find out. And that's a blood draw. Nobody likes those, but it's looking at probably a blood count, serum iron transference, saturation, and binding capacity, and ferritin. And that way you can tell, is iron truly depleted? Do you need to supplement? How much? And of course, iron supplements aren't safe to play with because iron is a toxin as well as a necessary element. And again, down that other angle, that's not easy in our system to do. It's not profitable. Those are cheap labs. Any doctor can order them. You don't need to go to a functional medicine doctor. But does it get done? The answer is no. So for this child, part of what he's presenting with picky eating, shiners, I don't know if there's behavior in there. One part of
just
that is iron, and quite likely, and easy to fix. Easy to fix. The other part that those little shiners under the eyes might indicate is some kind of a allergy or sensitivity, and it might be to a food. And that also isn't complicated to investigate. It's just not done in our system, our healthcare system.
just, oh, your child's not sleeping well, or how do they sleep? Do they wake up frequently? You know what I mean? If your kids have bags under the eyes, and that's sort of how it's addressed.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, of course, you need iron to sleep well too.
You need
Um,
minerals, you need a lot of the things that, we're talking about here. Yeah.
yeah. So where does that parent go, right? That's the dilemma.
I think, right, you need someone who knows the lab test to order. And then I think you need someone who can interpret the ranges, because that's, you mentioned reference ranges.
Mhm.
Um, we were talking just a minute ago, and oftentimes, the reference ranges on these labs are A, they're meant for adults, but B, they're also meant to represent, the 95% of the population. So if you land anywhere outside of that, very edges there, the ranges may not make sense.
Right. Or if you're fluttering to the edges, that's probably not ideal. And that would, when I look at labs with that lens, basically, that's exactly like how you're describing. I will interpret them through that lens and in the context of that kid. So if I've got a kid with a hemoglobin of like 11 or even 12, it's on the lower marginal end, but their serum iron is maybe 40. That's not great. They're not going to hit the button. The anemia bells aren't going to go off for your pediatrician, but
Sub
they may need some iron, or you may just need to give them different foods for that. So yeah, and we're back to the picky eating, and that's the next layer, is to look at what's going on with that child's gut to engender picky eating. So there's all these layers that can be assessed, and these things are fixable. They're not really complicated. It just takes time and focus.
Picky eating, the kids are restrictive and so limited, and they're not eating the foods that nourish a healthy gut. Maybe they'll eat fruits, some select fruits, not a wide variety. You're probably never getting vegetables near them, right? And vegetables we know are critical. Whole grains can be dicey, like maybe white bread or bagels with butter, but we're not talking about any of the stuff that's actually nutritious or
No,
healthful.
right,
Um, so like, oatmeals or whole grains or things like that. So again, you're on this hamster wheel, you know.
right. Yeah, how do I get this cycle broken with families? it is really challenging, and I am always very indebted to the mostly moms, no shade to dads, but it's mostly moms I've worked with who take this on and who try to fix it and who they're like boots on the ground. As I always have told people, look, I can tell you what to do. I'm not going to tell you to do it. You got
Right.
to decide if you're going to do this or not. Like, don't make that my problem. There's a way out of this. And it isn't necessarily it's not take a pill. It's not fix it with an easy. It does mean us rolling up our sleeves and doing it. And that can be hard. I mean, specifically for the wheat and dairy kind of addiction, we've talked a little bit before, Therese, it does become an addiction. And in a gut that isn't digesting or assimilating those proteins normally, you end up with something that looks like a morphine compound. It's called either gliadorphin, which forms from gluten, or casomorphin, which forms from casein, which is milk protein. And in the context of a leaky gut, which a lot of children will have, especially if they're growth impaired, because that alone will engender leaky gut or dysbiosis, those foods become addictive because you are absorbing an addictive morphine-like compound from those proteins. And
And
until you break that, you have to bust that. And that's a thing. And what's so interesting to me is we've got clinics across the land for picky eating. We have ARFID now, avoidant restricted food intake disorder. I suspect a lot of those folks are stuck with this addictive pattern and nobody's assessed it. But there's a lot of science published on this going back 30 odd years. If you Google the phrase casomorphins, boom, a lot of hits on that. And you can read about what that does to brain and gut tissue and to the nervous system. So it's a completely unleveraged opportunity for kids who are really stuck with picky eating.
and the food manufacturers design their foods to make them highly addictive, particularly the ones that are based on wheat and dairy for kids. So
Yeah, yeah,
really, you're asking a lot of these children until you remove this stuff, right? Because if you think about just your own experience as an adult, like it's very easy to overeat ice cream, chips, not as easy to do that with salmon, chicken,
right,
broccoli.
right.
It is a real thing. And I do think even for adults that resonates. Like I have a hard time controlling myself around this. And it tends to be either a dairy-based product or a wheat-based product.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And so, yeah, there are all these solutions out there, and all these parents just kind of at wit's end, like you say, trying to figure out where do I go. And when it gets to the point where it really affects a child's well-being, their ability to go to school, fall asleep, make friends,
Learn. Yeah. Oh,
this is where it's kind of trickling down. And I think you and I are both here because we both want to see a pivot somehow that parents can tap into some support and some knowledge around that.
right. Or at least know who to talk to, right? And if
Right.
it's not getting the support they need from the pediatrician or the specialist they were referred to, who can they reach out to for help? Because there are people that have this knowledge and they can help, but it's hard to find in the current medical structure.
Yeah, and I think that's bingo. That's like full circle why we're doing this podcast. We want to start it. We want to have a forum for parents to hear what help looks like and maybe how you find it. We'd love to have stories if people contact us and say, share a story. Like how did you fix this, or how do you want to fix whatever. We'd love to pick it apart, do case studies and stuff. I mean, even for today, we could sit here and I could list off a bunch of lab tests I would do for that child. I would say, if I knew his date of birth and his birth weight and his parent stature, I'd look at the growth history. How much would I expect that kid to weigh today? How much food does that mean he should be eating? I mean, there's rubrics for all this. There's math for all of this. And it's not rocket science. It just takes getting it done.
It also just takes time. And the medical complex is not designed to allow a practitioner to have time.
Exactly, so true. Yeah. So it's falling, I think it's landing hard on parents
Yes.
to
Oh,
figure it out. Yeah. And it's not easy. We don't, the whole point here is you're not alone, right? Yeah,
it's hard because the internet is amazing in the access to knowledge that it gives you, but there's also a lot of quackery out there. And that's why it's important to make sure that you're working with someone who is actually credentialed, who actually has some basis of knowledge to, work with you and serve you.
right.
Um, there's a lot of alternative, coaches and different people who call themselves healers or practitioners. But it really is important to make sure that they have the education and the background and the practice to
Yeah.
guide you.
I can
I,
so vouch for that. I think a lot of us are confused. A lot of people are confused about what are those credentials and what do they mean? And children who've been really led astray with protocols that were very inappropriate for them. So, and that'll be another topic we can do another time is like, what are all these diets? What are all these protocols? And not to say, oh, they're all terrible, don't do anything. It's like, how do you discern? We need discernment here.
yeah, and I think anything super extreme for children it should raise a red flag.
Yeah. Yeah.
Children, like you can't eliminate carbohydrates; they need carbs.
They do. It's true. That's a
Like,
biggie right there.
I know, and part of the reason I think this like rose in popularity a little bit was because of the success of the ketogenic diet with epilepsy.
Right.
Um, Known success there, but that's one specific medical state. But I don't know that it is wise to apply that, keto
Yeah.
diet.
That's a great topic right there. It's also become really popular in the autism community. Yeah, we should dive into that one too. So why don't we wrap this up? We've got so many topics we could do.
We're going to post the podcast. We're going to put it on YouTube. We'll put information out about how you can reach us. We'd love to hear from you, hear your stories, hear your struggles, and let us help.
So much more to come. And I'll look forward to the next podcast. I know we're both excited about this. So thank you.
Absolutely. Super fun.
All right.